A reoccurring memory I hold from my childhood is my sister and I watching true crime TV programs. You know the type. Daytime TV about murders, abductions, kidnappings. It intrigued us even as children, to the point that I do remember at least one year where true crime was the background noise to us putting up the Christmas tree. As I've grown older, I've actively sought out true crime content, from Eleanor Neal's YouTube videos to watching documentaries and miniseries on Netflix, to even writing my A-level English coursework comparing the depiction of a female criminal in Great Expectations to how the media depicted a real-life suspected female criminal. Some cases have the whole nation or even the whole world watching, as seen in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, that still receives funding and speculation from the British public to this day. Other cases are personally intriguing to us, or else are cases we cannot stand to hear about. The case I have always and will always avoid is Jack the Ripper. Something about that case just makes me feel like someone is stood behind me watching me, even when my back is to a wall. And that's not even to mention the cases that took place close to where I grew up, that I would talk to my parents about, and they would mention details of the case from memory because they happened in their lifetimes. But when I search out this true crime media and when I talk to others about it, I can't help but notice that the people most engaged with this true crime content seem to be women. So as the popularity of individual cases has grown on social media, and as creators and production companies have attempted to satiate the interest in the genre, I've come to wonder what it is we find so appealing about true crime content, and why it is that women seem to be the most enthralled. So let's explore the origins of the genre, its appeal, and the ethical questions that surround it. Part 1. The rise of a genre. What do we mean when we talk about true crime? Well, most of us probably think of cases of violent crimes, murders, sexual assault, crimes of that variety. But the genre in general is media focused on any crimes that have actually happened. They are recounting fact, not fiction. Now, some people may use true crime to inspire their fiction, like Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll, which was inspired by the sorority that was targeted by Ted Bundy. Nowadays, some of the most popular ways of consuming true crime is through online media, such as YouTube and TikTok videos, docuseries and dramatized depictions, and also podcasts. And whilst true crime is a topic of interest in newspapers and affected communities or through the oral tradition, is something that has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The beginning of the modern era of true crime is often credited to Truman Capote's publication of his 1965 true crime novel, In Cold Blood. Studying In Cold Blood was perhaps one of the most interesting parts of my first year of studying English literature at undergrad, because it featured on a module called Intro to the Novel. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a novel is defined as an invented prose narrative that is usually long and complex and deals especially with human experience through a usually connected sequence of events. An invented prose narrative. And yet In Cold Blood details the 1959 murder of the Clutter family in the small town of Holcomb, Kansas. A murder that did in fact happen. Famously, Capote developed a relationship with the murders as they awaited execution in order to write the book in the first place. The book, although known as In Cold Blood, was originally published as, and can still be seen listed as, In Cold Blood, a true account of a multiple murder and its consequences. Capote always intended to tell a true story. And whilst the details of the case as they unfold are methodically detailed in the book, there is a clear interest both in the narrative and from Capote himself in the emotional states of the killers. This is suggested to be the reasoning behind Capote's vested interest in conducting interviews with them prior to their execution, more so perhaps than his interest in telling the story of the Clutter family. Therefore, In Cold Blood is the first piece of true crime media as we regard it today, and also the first true crime novel, and perhaps the first piece of dramatized true crime media. It is meant for entertainment rather than purely to inform, but it's not wholly intended to sensationalize the case either. This perhaps is further emphasized by critical responses to the novel that question the complete truth of it, considering whether there is an attempt to create further interest or weave a better narrative in the fictionalized version of the case. Nonetheless, the genre has continued to grow across media, especially in the world of social media, streaming services, and the seemingly continuous propensity for the creation of more and more true crime podcasts. Another point many will say is significant in the rise of the true crime genre is the O.J. Simpson trial of the mid-90s. With the combination of cameras entering the courtroom and the high-profile nature of the case, the O.J. Simpson trial was a media mega hit, with millions tuning in every day to watch court coverage or else talking heads debriefing the proceedings of the day. In the article, The O.J. Effect, From Cable News to True Crime, How the O.J. Simpson Trial Reshaped Popular Culture, the trial is regarded as a petri dish for much of our current pop culture landscape, and goes on to say, the way we all became litigators online, exonerating and crucifying celebrities for their every caught-on-camera digression or bad tweet, is just an echo of the headlines and dining room conversations of the 90s. The Simpson case even whet our current appetite for true crime shows like Don't Fuck with Cats and Dahmer. And with dramatized versions of the trial, such as season 1 of American Crime Story, The People vs. O.J. Simpson, bring in the interest of a whole new generation, it's clear to see that this trial both impacted the true crime culture and has become shaped by it in cultural consciousness. And pretty much everyone in the UK can tell you about the speculation and fascination that is still rife surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. The then 3-year-old went missing in May of 2007 when the McCann family were holidaying in Praia da Luz, Portugal. Yet 17 years later in 2024, the Home Office provided the case with £192,000 of funding. And that's after £13.2 million has already been spent by the Metropolitan Police on the case as of March 2024. Many argue that the public and media interest in this case is the reason why it is still open and receiving funding. In some cases, this interest is helpful. It can lead to breakthroughs in cold cases or can help raise funding to overturn wrongful convictions. However, whilst true crime can be considered a genre that serves justice through direct impact, it can also be seen to complicate and at times obstruct a formal investigation. A clear example of this is in the 2022 University of Idaho massacre, also known as the Idaho Murders. As noted by Zuckerberger for Time, while high-profile cases can garner the attention necessary to bring new tips forward, they can also endanger innocent people and be the cause of much misinformation. And this was the case here, with misinformation rife and accusations often being made with little to no information or evidence due to internet sleuths and armchair detectives investigating the case. On TikTok alone, hashtags surrounding the case gained over 1 billion views, with thousands of users posting about the case and searching for information. This is a perfect example of how the obsession surrounding true crime means not only are people consuming media surrounding certain cases, but they are trying to actively get involved with the conversation surrounding them. In essence, true crime is a genre that I do not anticipate we will see slowing down anytime soon, as seen by the rise of interest in the Lyle and Erik Menendez case on social media, leading to the documentary film The Menendez Brothers, and then the dramatized version Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story on Netflix, both in 2024. This influx of media surrounding specific cases can also be seen in the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes and also Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, both in 2022. And the Netflix limited series, The Ted Bundy Tapes, alongside the film Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile about Ted Bundy in 2019. The success of these formats, whether documentaries or dramatized anthology series focusing on different cases each series, has been proven. Now, obviously, this is only a taste of what the true crime genre has become. You can type pretty much any case into YouTube and you will find various videos discussing the case, some to better degrees than others. But especially in the case of dramatized portrayals of true crime cases, we can wonder who it is that these pieces of true crime media are attempting to entertain, and whether in fact that should be the goal of the genre at all. Part 2, the targeted audience. I've always wondered why I hate horror. As someone with anxiety, it makes my heart beat at a rate even I'm not used to. But I am intrigued by true crime. I've wondered why the criminology course offered at my sixth form was taken overwhelmingly by women. And I've wondered why the audience who take a vested interest in true crime are often the victims depicted in the genre. A YouGov study in 2022 found that just over 50% of participants who enjoy the true crime genre were women, with 18% of women saying true crime was their favourite genre and 40% of women saying true crime was a genre they enjoyed. A Pew Research Center study of the same year suggested that 34% of US podcast listeners listen to true crime podcasts regularly, and of this 34%, women were twice as likely than men to listen to true crime podcasts. And interestingly, younger podcast listeners were more likely to enjoy the genre as well, with 41% of listeners 18 to 29 years old saying they enjoy engaging with the true crime genre, versus only 15% of those 65 and older who listen to podcasts. But what actually is it about true crime that draws us in? The article, "These Women Use True Crime Podcasts to Lull Themselves to Sleep. Experts Explain Why It Works," explores this idea further in conversation with David Schmidt, an assistant professor of English at the University of Buffalo. Some quotes of interest from Schmidt in this article are: "The interest in the subject comes from women's awareness that they are the victim of a vast majority of interpersonal violent crimes, especially crimes like serial murder. And you can turn off the TV or turn off your laptop or close the book. It's the way you experience the fear. You experience some of these feelings, but in a way you are in control." So there are two elements being explored here. One, the ability to face fear through the genre, and two, the search for knowledge as self-preservation. Not only statistically, but socially, women are taught from childhood that we are essentially targets. It's a point that calls back to conversations in the past few years, especially following the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women study that suggested 97% of women in the UK have experienced some form of sexual harassment. A conversation that highlights an environment where it has become a common experience of girlhood to make sure you text your friends when you get in from a night out, because there is a real chance that you won't make it home. Where we walk without headphones in, have keys grasped in our hands, and lock our cars as soon as the door closes behind us. Where when it's dark, I will shine a torch into my backseat to make sure it's clear before getting into my car. And where I had the experience of sitting in a sociology class at 16, and when we were asked to put our hands up if we had ever been sexually harassed, I, along with every single one of the girls sat in that classroom, raised our hands. Whilst we have been taught to proactively avoid situations that could cause us harm, and I do think that is what a lot of people are looking to be informed on by watching or listening to true crime content, this does harbour an innately victim-blaming mentality that focuses on teaching young girls to adapt rather than challenging the culture of violence itself. And I think on a level, our interest as women on true crime is the hope that we can learn from situations and be able to protect ourselves better in the future. But the thing is, no matter how safe you try to be, that doesn't change the culture that we are still existing within, where violence is perpetuated against us. Similarly, because harassment and violence is such a common experience for women, it's possible that we find comfort in engaging with true crime content because it rationalizes our fear by letting us know these things really do happen. And it also allows us to face the fear of these possibilities in our own environments where the pause button is at our mercy. This is explored by Amelia Anthony for Psych in the article "Listening In on Horror: Why Many Women Love True Crime Podcasts," in reference to the true crime podcast form specifically. By listening to violent true crime media, the listener can access past traumatic experiences and fears of future traumatic experiences. Yet unlike these experiences, the podcast can be paused or skipped through. Its auditory-only form permits a safe level of separation between the listening experience and the material world of the listener. In this case, we can consider true crime as acting as a conduit for fear, as both a type of exposure therapy and also as a reassurance that we are not being unnecessarily hypervigilant. Unlike fiction, true crime carries the realities of the horrors we are constantly hyper aware of, acting to validate that fear whilst also creating a reverse power dynamic for the listener, who is both the target audience of true crime media and the targeted audience within the genre. And of course, there is always the possibility that at one point in time, women engaged with the true crime genre more, and so the genre itself adapted to specifically target female audiences. So are women drawn to true crime because it addresses and reifies our fears of violence that we are taught to harbour for our own protection? Or is it in fact just morbid curiosity that keeps us hooked? Either way, I think we have to question whether true crime is something we can ethically interact with. Part 3, the ethics of true crime media. So all of this brings me to the question, is true crime ethical to produce? And is true crime ethical to consume? Like I said at the beginning of this video, I have a propensity for consuming true crime media. Each time I watch a documentary or listen to a podcast on true crime, I make a vested effort to remember that this is a crime that actually occurred to a victim, and that there are still people who are affected by it to this day. Similarly, I try to be aware of the level of respect given to a victim by the creator when I engage with content, whether that be podcasters or social media content creators or the writers and producers of miniseries. Particularly in the case of dramatized depictions of true crime cases, there are often issues around whether creators consult the victims or the victims' families and get their permission before creating and distributing this media. And one of my biggest critiques of the true crime genre is that I think sometimes it loses sight of the fact that these are true cases. The most evident truth of this to me is the fact that we name pieces of media surrounding these cases after the killers or the perpetrators of these crimes, whilst many will watch them and not be able to tell you the names of the victims by the time they have finished. Stacey Nye is quoted in the article, "The Double-Edged Sword of True Crime Stories' Popularity, a UWM professor explains," talking about some of her issues with the true crime genre. For example, whilst victims aren't always named and discussed, those that are far more likely to be white women. There's a huge number of women of colour, Indigenous women and trans women who are targeted, and that's talked about much less. So I think it would be really important if we're going to continue to put content like this out to try to focus or balance our perspective. Nye also notes how the demonization of mental illness is perpetuated through the true crime genre, often by equating violent crimes with mental illness. I want to say for the record that most people have some form of mental illness at some point in their life, and people who become serial killers are really quite rare. People who become violent murderers may have some form of mental illness, but you can't equate the two at all whatsoever. Ruth Davison, CEO of domestic abuse charity Refuge, is also quoted discussing the problematic aspects of true crime in Cosmopolitan. Consumers of true crime often contemplate what they would have done differently or pass judgment without knowing the full reality of the situation. We must be clear. Violence against women and girls is a crime. It is not something to be consumed by armchair detectives, and there is never an excuse for domestic abuse. It is an active decision a perpetrator makes. So whilst we can point out some of the issues with depictions in the genre, are there also issues with the genre itself? Primarily the fact that people are profiting off the tragic events of others, and largely without the victims or their families being able to consent after their bodily autonomy has already been taken away from them in the first place. It's incredibly difficult to find a consensus on this topic, even within ourselves. I myself have conflicting opinions. True crime as a genre does aid in raising awareness and does increase the possibility that those with information may come forward. But there is also the possibility that misinformation gets spread, or worse, that the case becomes sensationalized because people are prioritizing entertainment overspreading information. I also understand finding comfort in true crime, which is a very strange sentence to say, I know. But I know I like true crime for the same reason that I don't like horror, and it's my ability to rationalize the events that occur. True crime is something concrete, and it's the horrors we know, whereas the horror genre usually creates something that's a lot harder to control our fear towards. At the end of the day, I think my stance is this. Whilst I think there is a benefit and use of true crime as a genre, specifically raising awareness and also ensuring that victims aren't forgotten in the fanfare that can often accompany a suspect to trial, I don't believe that all true crime content, especially dramatized true crime content, is ethical to produce or is ethical to consume, as consumption perpetuates the creation of it. And amongst all of this, there is also a conversation to be had about the effects of consuming true crime media. Is this truly a cathartic hobby long term, or does it have negative psychological effects on the audience who are statistically more likely to be targeted? Similarly, does having so much media available surrounding crimes create an upward trajectory in copycat killers, in idolization of criminals, in parasocial relationships with perpetrators, and with the potential to evade police custody? Arguably, the effect of the true crime genre is a whole other video in and of itself, away from the why of its consumption, as is the consideration of the ethics behind creating media that profits off the tragedies of others. But I do think in a world of social media and streaming services where content surrounding true crime cases is being produced at an unprecedented rate, it is very important to have conversations surrounding intentions. Intentions when these pieces are created and our intentions in consuming them. But one thing I will say to anyone who does consume true crime media is please make an effort to remember the names of the victims involved in the crime. It is their story, and whilst they should not only be remembered by the worst event to ever happen to them, they do deserve to be remembered. In this video, I have referenced and touched on very, very briefly many different cases, and as a result, I will leave down in the description a list of the names of victims involved in those cases. I strongly urge you to go and read them, especially if you are interested in researching any of those cases further. The true crime genre isn't going anywhere. I think we're all aware of that. But as consumers, the thing we are responsible for is understanding the intentions behind the media we consume and evaluating whether the ways in which we engage with these true crime cases is being done in a respectful manner.